The oncologist said, "Your husband's been picking up chemotherapy, but his blood work is perfect." Dr. Amelia Reyes pulled me aside after my appointment, her voice low and careful. I stood in the hallway of the cancer center, still wearing the hospital bracelet from my latest round of tests. She explained that my husband Derek had been collecting chemotherapy prescriptions for 6 months under his patient ID, but when she cross-referenced his file with the lab system, his blood panels showed no abnormalities, no cancer markers, no elevated white cell counts, nothing that would indicate malignancy or justify aggressive treatment. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Derek had told me about his diagnosis 8 months ago. Stage 2 lymphoma. Treatable but serious. He'd been going to appointments every other week, coming home exhausted and nauseous. I'd held his hand through what I thought was his suffering. Dr. Reyes handed me a folder with his blood work results spanning the past year. Every test came back completely normal. She said she was legally obligated to report this discrepancy to the medical board because prescribing chemotherapy to someone without cancer was malpractice, but she wanted to warn me first. Something wasn't right. I drove home in a fog, the folder burning on the passenger seat. Derek worked from home as an IT consultant, which meant he was always there when I got back from my job at the county clerk's office. Lately, I'd been so tired. Constant fatigue that made climbing stairs feel impossible. My hair had been thinning. I'd developed nausea that came in waves. My own doctor kept running tests but couldn't find anything definitive. She'd mentioned possibly referring me to a specialist for chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia. I pulled into our driveway and sat in the car for 10 minutes, watching Derek move past the living room window. He looked healthy, strong, not at all like someone undergoing chemotherapy. I thought about the nights he'd come home from his appointments, pale and shaking, going straight to bed. The medical bills I'd been paying from our joint account. The special diet he claimed he needed. All of it felt wrong now. That evening, I told Derek I'd stop by the pharmacy to pick up his prescription, testing him. He looked up from his laptop with concern and said he'd already gotten it yesterday. His assistant had dropped him off at the clinic during her lunch break. He asked if I was feeling okay because I looked pale. I said I was just tired and went upstairs. In our bathroom, I opened the medicine cabinet where Derek kept his medications. There were 3 pill bottles labeled with his name and chemotherapy drug names I'd memorized from supporting him. I photographed the labels with my phone and then carefully opened one bottle. The pills inside didn't match the description on the label. I'd learned enough about chemotherapy drugs to know that cyclophosphamide came in specific colors and shapes. These pills looked different. I took one and wrapped it in tissue, hiding it in my makeup bag. The next morning, I called Dr. Reyes from my office and asked if she could help identify a medication. She suggested I bring it to the hospital pharmacy, where they had pill identification resources. I drove over during my lunch break and handed the tissue-wrapped pill to the pharmacist, a woman named Kavita who'd helped me before. She examined it under magnification and checked several databases. After 15 minutes, she looked at me with a strange expression and said it was amitriptyline, a low-dose antidepressant. Not chemotherapy at all. I asked her to be certain, and she showed me the identification chart. The pill matched exactly. Derek had been filling prescriptions for chemotherapy drugs but keeping pills that were completely different in the bottles. Someone had switched them. But where were the real chemotherapy drugs going? I spent that afternoon at my desk unable to focus on work, turning the question over and over. If Derek wasn't taking the chemotherapy, where was it? Why would he fake cancer and collect dangerous drugs he wasn't using? Then I thought about my own symptoms. The exhaustion, hair loss, nausea, weight loss, all symptoms that could match chemotherapy side effects. I opened my browser and searched for ways to administer chemotherapy without someone knowing. The results made my hands go cold. Chemotherapy drugs could be crushed and dissolved in liquid. Some could be absorbed through skin contact. I thought about Derek making my coffee every morning for the past 6 months. His insistence on preparing my meals when I was too tired to cook. The way he'd started doing our laundry separately, claiming his clothes needed special detergent because of his sensitive skin from treatment. My stomach turned as the pattern became clear. I called my own doctor that afternoon and asked for an emergency appointment. Dr. Lisa Brennan had been treating me for 3 months, puzzled by my declining health. I arrived at her office at 4 and explained everything to her without Derek knowing I was there. I told her about Derek's fake cancer diagnosis, the pills that weren't chemotherapy, my worsening symptoms. She listened with growing alarm and immediately ordered comprehensive blood work, including specific tests for chemotherapy drug metabolites. She said if someone had been secretly giving me chemotherapy drugs, they'd show up in my system even days after exposure. The tests would take 48 hours for full results, but she'd put a rush on anything that looked concerning. She also documented everything I told her, creating a medical record of suspected poisoning. She advised me to stay somewhere else until we had answers, but I told her I needed to understand what Derek was doing before I confronted him or involved police. That night, I pretended everything was normal. Derek made dinner while I sat at the kitchen table watching him move around our kitchen. He'd always been attentive, but lately his care had become suffocating. He brought me a glass of water with dinner and I thanked him, then pretended to drink while actually pouring it into a plant when he turned away. The chicken he'd prepared tasted fine, but I ate slowly, watching for any sign that he'd tampered with my food. After dinner, he made coffee and brought me a cup, the way he had every night for months. I thanked him and set it on the coffee table, claiming I was too full. He looked disappointed but didn't push. I went to bed early, claiming exhaustion, and he followed an hour later. I waited until his breathing deepened into sleep, then got up and poured the coffee into a glass jar I'd hidden in the bathroom. I'd have it tested. The next morning, Derek made breakfast and coffee again. I accepted the coffee and pretended to drink it in front of him, then took it with me when I left for work. I stopped at Dr. Brennan's office and dropped off the jar with last night's coffee and this morning's cup. The receptionist labeled them and sent them to the lab for expedited analysis. I felt paranoid and justified at the same time. If I was wrong, I'd ruined my marriage with suspicion. If I was right, Derek had been systematically poisoning me for months. I drove to work and tried to function normally, but everything felt surreal. My coworkers asked if I was feeling better and I lied, saying I was improving. In truth, I felt worse than ever. My body ached. My vision blurred periodically. I'd lost 12 pounds in 2 months. Dr. Brennan called me at 2 p.m, her voice tight with controlled anger. The preliminary results showed trace amounts of fluorouracil in both coffee samples. Fluorouracil was a chemotherapy drug commonly used to treat various cancers. It was toxic, especially when given to someone without medical supervision or legitimate medical need. She'd already contacted the police and hospital administration. They wanted me to come in immediately for a full examination and formal statement. I told her I would, but first I needed to understand the full scope of what Derek was doing. She protested, saying this was dangerous, but I insisted. If Derek was drugging me with chemotherapy, there had to be a reason. People didn't poison their spouses without motivation. I needed to know what I was dealing with before everything exploded. I left work early, telling my supervisor I had a medical appointment. Instead, I drove to our bank and requested complete transaction records for our joint account and Derek's individual account. The banker, someone I'd known for years through my job at the clerk's office, printed everything without asking too many questions. I sat in my car reviewing 6 months of statements. Derek had been withdrawing cash regularly, $500 every week. He'd also been transferring money from our joint savings into his individual account, small amounts that I hadn't noticed because I'd been too sick to monitor our finances carefully. Over 6 months, he'd moved $40,000. Our savings was nearly empty. I'd been too exhausted to check our balance, trusting Derek to manage our money while I focused on trying to stay functional at work. I called my sister Natalie from the bank parking lot. She lived 3 hours away but answered immediately when she heard my voice shaking. I told her everything in one long rush about Derek's fake cancer, the chemotherapy in my coffee, the missing money. She was silent for several seconds, then said she was getting in her car right now. She told me not to go home, not to be alone with Derek, to meet her at a hotel near the highway. I agreed and drove to a budget motel, checking in under my maiden name. I sat on the bed in that sterile room and finally let myself cry. The man I'd been married to for 7 years had been poisoning me, deliberately making me sick while pretending to be sick himself, stealing our money while I was too weak to notice. I didn't understand why. What could possibly motivate someone to do this to their spouse? Natalie arrived after dark, bursting into the motel room with groceries and fierce determination. She'd always been protective, but now her anger on my behalf was palpable. She made me eat actual food while I explained everything again in more detail. She wanted to call the police immediately, but I showed her the bank statements and said I needed to understand what Derek was using the money for before we involved authorities. If this was just about stealing from me, that was one crime. But if there was something bigger, I needed to know. Natalie argued that my safety mattered more than understanding Derek's motivations, but finally agreed to help me investigate for one more day. After that, we were going to the police regardless. We spent that night researching Derek's recent activity. Natalie used her laptop while I used my phone, careful not to access any accounts Derek might monitor. I checked his social media, which I rarely looked at because I'd been too tired. He'd been posting regularly about his cancer journey, documenting his supposed struggle with photos that must have been staged. Hundreds of people had commented with support and encouragement. Several had sent money through donation links he'd created. I clicked through to his crowdfunding page and felt sick all over again. He'd raised $60,000 from friends, family, colleagues, and strangers who believed he was fighting lymphoma. The page was full of updates about difficult treatments and hopeful progress. All lies. He'd been collecting sympathy donations while poisoning me. Natalie found something worse. She'd searched Derek's name with various terms and discovered he'd been active on several online forums under a username we identified through cross-referencing details from his posts. On these forums, he'd been offering consulting services for people who wanted to fake illnesses for insurance claims or disability benefits. He'd been coaching others on how to obtain medical documentation, how to present symptoms convincingly, how to navigate the system. He'd been selling his expertise, charging hundreds of dollars per consultation. The forums were filled with his advice, detailed and specific. He'd turned fraud into a business, and I was somehow part of it. I couldn't sleep that night, lying in the motel bed while Natalie researched in the other bed, her laptop screen glowing in the darkness. Around 3 a.m, she made a sound of discovery and turned the screen toward me. She'd found Derek's secondary email account through a password recovery link on one of the forums. She'd managed to access it using information she knew about Derek from family gatherings. Inside were hundreds of emails. Derek had been communicating with someone named Gregory Fan, who ran a network of people staging medical fraud across multiple states. Derek was a regional coordinator, recruiting others and providing technical support for falsifying medical records. The chemotherapy prescriptions were part of a larger scheme to bill insurance companies for treatments that were never actually administered. Derek would collect the drugs, submit claims for full treatment costs, then sell the actual medications on a black market while giving me just enough to make me genuinely sick. The emails revealed why he'd been poisoning me specifically. Gregory had suggested that having a genuinely ill spouse would provide cover if anyone questioned Derek's own fake diagnosis. If investigators came looking, Derek could point to me and claim confusion about whose medications were whose, or suggest that I'd been the sick one all along and he'd been trying to help. I was his insurance policy, a scapegoat being systematically destroyed to protect his criminal enterprise. The cruelty was so calculated it took my breath away. The emails discussed dosing strategies, how much chemotherapy to give me to cause symptoms without killing me outright. They'd been experimenting with my body like I was a test subject. Natalie wanted to call the police immediately, but I stopped her. I said we needed more evidence, something that would take down the entire network, not just Derek. If we acted now, he might have time to destroy evidence or warn his associates. She argued that I was in danger, that every day I waited was another day Derek could hurt me. But I'd already been poisoned for months. A few more days wouldn't make a difference, and I wanted everyone involved to face consequences. We agreed to gather as much evidence as possible before going to authorities. Natalie started downloading emails and forum posts, creating a comprehensive file. I focused on documenting the financial trail, connecting Derek's withdrawals to payments he'd received through various online platforms. The next morning, I called in sick to work, which wasn't hard to justify given how terrible I felt. Natalie and I drove to Dr. Brennan's office, where I finally gave my formal statement about the poisoning. She'd been waiting anxiously, having already contacted police about the preliminary test results. I explained that I needed a few more days to gather evidence for a larger case. Dr. Brennan was unhappy but understood. She examined me thoroughly and started me on supportive treatment to help my body process the chemotherapy drugs Derek had been giving me. She said I'd been receiving doses that were toxic but not immediately lethal, carefully calculated to cause chronic illness. Long-term exposure could cause permanent organ damage. I needed to stop all contact with Derek immediately and begin aggressive hydration and monitoring. Dr. Reyes joined us, bringing Derek's complete medical file. She'd been conducting her own investigation after our initial conversation. Derek had been seeing multiple doctors across 3 different hospital systems, collecting diagnoses and prescriptions by presenting falsified test results. He'd been manufacturing medical records using his IT skills, creating believable forgeries that passed initial scrutiny. Dr. Reyes had alerted all 3 hospitals, and their fraud departments were now investigating. She'd also reported him to the medical board and the insurance fraud division. The institutions were building criminal cases, but they were moving slowly, gathering evidence systematically. I told her about the larger network we'd discovered, and her expression hardened. She said she'd connect the investigators with the information we'd found. I finally called the police that afternoon, meeting with Detective Raymond Foster at the station. He specialized in medical fraud and was already aware of Derek's case through Dr. Brennan's report. I showed him everything we'd found, the emails, the forum posts, the financial records, the crowdfunding fraud. He spent 2 hours reviewing it all, asking detailed questions about timeline and evidence sources. He said this was bigger than a simple domestic poisoning case. This was organized crime, conspiracy to commit fraud across state lines, potentially dozens of victims. The FBI would need to be involved. He wanted me to stay away from Derek while they built their case, but he also suggested something else. If I was willing, I could help them gather additional evidence by maintaining contact with Derek while wearing a wire. The direct evidence of him discussing the poisoning would strengthen the case significantly. I agreed without hesitation, despite Natalie's protests. Detective Foster arranged for me to meet with FBI agents the next day. In the meantime, he wanted me to stay somewhere safe. Natalie and I moved to a different hotel, this one farther from our home, and I texted Derek a carefully crafted message. I told him I'd been staying with Natalie because I felt so sick, but I missed him and wanted to come home soon. He responded immediately, concerned and loving, asking about my symptoms and whether I'd seen a doctor. The manipulation was so smooth it made my skin crawl. He suggested I come home that evening, that he'd take care of me. I told him I'd come back tomorrow, needing 1 more day to rest. He sent heart emojis and said he'd prepare my favorite meal. The FBI agents met me at a federal building downtown. Agent Tessa Kowalski and Agent David Nguyen specialized in healthcare fraud. They'd been investigating Gregory Fan's network for 18 months, aware of the operation but struggling to penetrate it. Derek's emails provided the breakthrough they needed. They showed me surveillance photos of Gregory and several other network members, asking if I recognized anyone. I didn't, but they explained that Derek was a significant player in the organization, managing fraud schemes across 5 states. He'd recruited at least 20 people into the network. The total fraud they'd uncovered so far exceeded $5 million. They wanted me to help them document Derek's direct involvement by recording conversations where he discussed the poisoning and the larger operation. Agent Kowalski fitted me with a recording device, a small unit that looked like a fitness tracker but contained a microphone and transmitter. She explained that I'd be under surveillance the entire time I was home. They'd have agents nearby, and if anything seemed dangerous, they'd intervene immediately. She coached me on how to guide conversations toward admissions without being obvious. Let Derek feel comfortable, ask questions from a place of vulnerability, express fear about my health, and see if he revealed anything about causing it. They needed him to incriminate himself clearly. I practiced with them for several hours, running through scenarios until I felt marginally prepared. Natalie watched from the observation room, her face tight with worry. I went home the next evening, my heart hammering as I pulled into our driveway. Derek came out to meet me, helping me from the car with exaggerated concern. He'd lost weight and looked genuinely unwell, which I realized was probably intentional. He was maintaining his cancer patient appearance for any neighbors or friends who might see him. Inside, he'd prepared dinner and the house was immaculate. He guided me to the couch, bringing me water and asking detailed questions about how I'd been feeling at Natalie's house. I told him I'd been exhausted and nauseous, that my hair was falling out more each day. He made sympathetic sounds and said maybe we should both see specialists together. Maybe there was something environmental affecting us both. The suggestion was so calculated I nearly reacted, but I caught myself and just nodded weakly. Derek brought me dinner on a tray, pasta with vegetables and a glass of water. I ate slowly, watching him watch me. The food tasted normal, but I knew better than to trust anything he prepared. I'd taken precautions, eating a full meal before coming home and bringing antacids to help me vomit later if necessary. Derek sat beside me and talked about his own health, how his last treatment had been particularly difficult. He described symptoms I now knew he wasn't experiencing, building his false narrative. I asked him questions about his chemotherapy, playing the concerned wife, and he answered smoothly with details he must have researched. He was a convincing liar, confident and detailed. If I hadn't known the truth, I'd never have suspected. After dinner, Derek insisted I rest while he cleaned up. I went to our bedroom and lay down, the recording device secure against my skin. Through the wall, I heard Derek in the kitchen, the sound of running water and dishes clattering. Then I heard him talking on the phone, his voice too quiet to make out words. I got up carefully and moved closer to the door, holding my breath. He was saying something about shipment and timing. I opened the door silently and moved into the hallway. His voice became clearer. He said the latest batch had been successful, that his contact at the hospital had confirmed the drugs were high quality. He discussed prices and quantities. He was arranging a sale of chemotherapy medications right now, casual and businesslike. I retreated to the bedroom before he finished the call. Derek came to check on me an hour later, finding me in bed. He asked if I needed anything, and I told him I was worried about how sick I'd been getting. I asked if he thought something was wrong with our house, maybe mold or contamination. He sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand, his expression sympathetic. He said he'd wondered the same thing, that maybe whatever was making him sick was also affecting me. He suggested we could both take time off work, maybe stay with his parents while we figured it out. The suggestion was designed to isolate me further, I realized, get me away from my support system and deeper into his control. I pretended to consider it, then asked if he thought his chemotherapy could be affecting me somehow. Maybe exposure to his medications? Derek's expression didn't change, but I felt his hand tighten slightly on mine. He said that was unlikely, that chemotherapy wasn't contagious. But then he paused and said maybe I should get tested for cancer too, just to be safe. Maybe we both had something genetic or environmental triggering illness. The way he said it made my stomach turn. He was already preparing his defense, building a narrative where I was genuinely sick with my own condition, where he could claim confusion about whose medications were whose. I told him I was scared, and he pulled me into a hug, stroking my hair. He whispered that we'd figure this out together, that he'd take care of me. His voice was so gentle it took everything in me not to pull away. That night, Derek made chamomile tea, bringing me a cup before bed. I thanked him and held it, pretending to sip while he got ready for bed. When he went to brush his teeth, I poured the tea into a bottle I'd hidden in my nightstand, then refilled the cup with water from the bathroom sink. Derek came back and I showed him the empty cup, saying the tea had helped. He looked pleased. We lay in bed together in the darkness, and I felt him relax into sleep beside me. I stayed awake for hours, the recording device capturing his steady breathing, my mind racing through everything I'd learned. This man had been poisoning me for months. He'd been stealing our money and running criminal schemes. He'd been preparing to frame me if he got caught. And he slept peacefully, unburdened by any apparent guilt. I met with the FBI agents the next morning while Derek was supposedly at a doctor's appointment. I'd actually been tracking his phone, something I'd started doing after discovering the truth. He was at a warehouse on the industrial side of town. Agent Kowalski downloaded the recording from my device and listened with headphones, her expression growing harder as she heard Derek's phone conversation about drug sales. This was exactly what they needed. Direct evidence of him dealing chemotherapy medications. Combined with the poisoning, the insurance fraud, and the network communications, they had enough to arrest him and begin dismantling the entire operation. Agent Nguyen showed me surveillance photos from that morning. They'd followed Derek to the warehouse, where he'd met with 3 other men. One was Gregory Fan. They'd photographed the meeting and observed money and packages changing hands. The agents explained their plan. They'd arrest Derek within 48 hours, coordinating with raids on Gregory's locations and several other network members simultaneously. They wanted to catch everyone before word could spread. They needed me to stay away from Derek during this time, to be somewhere safe when the arrests happened. I could stay in FBI protective custody, or with family if I preferred. I chose Natalie, who'd been waiting at her apartment for my call. The agents drove me there, ensuring I wasn't followed. Natalie held me while I finally broke down, crying for the marriage I'd thought I had, the husband I'd believed in, the life that had been built on lies and poison. She kept saying it wasn't my fault, but part of me wondered how I'd missed the signs for so long. How had I not known? Dr. Brennan called that afternoon with more test results. The chemotherapy exposure had damaged my kidneys and liver, not severely, but measurably. I'd need months of monitoring and treatment to ensure no permanent harm. She'd also found evidence that Derek had been giving me increasing doses over time, suggesting he'd been experimenting or perhaps planning to escalate to a lethal amount eventually. The thought made me nauseous. She'd documented everything for the criminal case, creating medical evidence that would be impossible to dispute. She also told me she'd contacted the 23 other patients who'd received prescriptions from the same pharmacy Derek used. Several of them were his fraud network members, picking up medications under false pretenses. The web of criminality kept expanding. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning. Agent Kowalski called to tell me it was happening, and I sat in Natalie's apartment watching news coverage on my phone. Derek was arrested at our house, video showing him being let out in handcuffs while neighbors watched. Gregory Fan was arrested at his office. 18 other people were arrested simultaneously across 5 states. The news reported it as a major healthcare fraud bust, announcing charges of conspiracy, insurance fraud, drug trafficking, and assault. My name wasn't mentioned, but the coverage noted that one of the arrested individuals had been poisoning a family member with chemotherapy drugs. I watched Derek's face in the video footage, looking for some reaction, but he just looked angry, not remorseful or shocked. Just angry he'd been caught. The prosecution contacted me 2 days later. They wanted my testimony for the grand jury and eventually trial. The case against Derek was overwhelming, they said. The emails, the recordings, the financial records, the medical evidence, the surveillance footage. He'd been offered a plea deal but refused, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. His attorney was arguing that I'd been sick with an undiagnosed condition, that Derek had been trying to help me by giving me medications, that the fraud charges were exaggerated. The prosecutors needed me to tell my story directly, to show the jury that this wasn't a tragic misunderstanding, but deliberate, calculated abuse. I agreed immediately. I wanted Derek to face every consequence of what he'd done. The grand jury hearing was in a federal courthouse downtown. I testified for 3 hours, walking through the entire timeline from Dr. Reyes's initial warning to the FBI raid. I explained how Derek had made my coffee every morning, how I'd gotten progressively sicker, how he'd stolen our savings while pretending to have cancer. I described finding the falsified medications and discovering the network. The grand jury members listened with visible outrage, several of them taking notes throughout. When I finished, the prosecutor thanked me and said my testimony had been clear and compelling. The grand jury indicted Derek on 17 federal charges. His trial date was set for 4 months away. I moved into a new apartment during that waiting period, unable to return to the house I'd shared with Derek. Natalie helped me pack my belongings, and we donated or threw away everything Derek had touched. I kept nothing that reminded me of him. Dr. Brennan monitored my recovery, which was slow but steady. My energy started returning as my body processed the remaining chemotherapy drugs. My hair stopped falling out. The nausea faded. I looked in the mirror one morning and saw color in my face for the first time in months. I looked alive again, no longer the pale, exhausted ghost I'd been. Physical healing was happening, even as emotional recovery felt impossible. The crowdfunding platform refunded the donations Derek had collected, issuing statements about fraud prevention and vetting processes. $60,000 went back to the people who'd believed his lies. The insurance companies filed civil suits seeking reimbursement for the fraudulent claims, totaling over $800,000. Derek's parents called me once, his mother crying and asking how this had happened. I told her I didn't know, that I'd been as deceived as everyone else. She apologized for not seeing it, for not protecting me from her son. I told her it wasn't her fault. Derek had fooled professionals, investigators, doctors. He'd been skilled at deception, which made him dangerous. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified on the second day, facing Derek across the courtroom. He stared at me while I spoke, his expression cold and angry. I told the jury everything, holding nothing back. I described the poisoning, the symptoms, the fear of not knowing what was wrong with me. I explained discovering the truth and the betrayal that came with it. The defense attorney cross-examined me aggressively, suggesting I'd been genuinely sick and was now inventing a conspiracy. But the medical evidence was irrefutable. Dr. Brennan testified after me, explaining the chemotherapy metabolites in my blood, the organ damage, the timeline of poisoning. Dr. Reyes testified about Derek's falsified records and impossible blood work. Agent Kowalski presented the emails and recordings. The case built itself, piece by piece, until Derek's guilt was undeniable. Gregory Fan testified against Derek as part of his own plea agreement, describing the network's operations and Derek's role. He explained how Derek had suggested using me as a cover, how they'd calculated dosing to keep me sick but alive. He detailed the drug trafficking operation, the millions in fraudulent claims, the systematic abuse of medical systems. His testimony was clinical and devastating. Derek's attorney tried to discredit him as a criminal saving himself, but Gregory's account matched every piece of physical evidence the prosecution had presented. The jury deliberated for 8 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 17 charges. Derek was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The judge called his crimes heinous and calculating, noting that he'd exploited medical systems designed to help sick people while simultaneously poisoning his own wife. She said Derek had shown no remorse and demonstrated clear danger to society. She handed down the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. I sat in the courtroom and felt something release in my chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but closure. Derek would spend decades in prison. He couldn't hurt me anymore. He couldn't hurt anyone else. The civil suit against Derek resulted in judgments totaling over $900,000 from insurance companies and fraud victims. He had minimal assets after legal fees, but the judgments would follow him forever. His professional reputation was destroyed. His family disowned him publicly, his parents releasing a statement condemning his actions and expressing support for his victims. The crowdfunding platform banned him permanently and added his case to their fraud prevention training. The medical board alerted hospitals nationwide about his falsified records. Every system he'd exploited closed its vulnerability. I started working with a victims advocacy group, talking to other people who'd experienced medical abuse or domestic poisoning. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of cases annually where family members used medications to control or harm their partners. Many went undetected because victims attributed symptoms to natural illness. I shared my story publicly, hoping it would help others recognize the signs. Several people contacted me after reading my story, saying they'd realized they were being poisoned and sought help. Those messages made the exposure feel worthwhile, turning my trauma into something that might prevent others from experiencing similar harm. Natalie remained my closest support through everything. She'd taken family leave from her job to stay with me during the trial and recovery. We grew closer than we'd been since childhood, spending evenings talking about rebuilding and healing. She encouraged me to try therapy, and I finally started seeing someone who specialized in trauma from intimate partner violence. The therapist helped me process the betrayal and violation, working through my anger and grief. She explained that what Derek had done wasn't just poisoning but a form of torture, systematically destroying my health and autonomy. Naming it that way helped me understand why recovery felt so difficult. A year after Derek's conviction, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about healthcare fraud and domestic abuse through medical manipulation. I told my story to elected officials, advocating for better safeguards and victim protections. The committee was developing legislation to address gaps in prescription monitoring and medical record verification. My testimony was cited in the bill, which eventually passed with bipartisan support. Knowing that my experience contributed to systemic change made the trauma feel less pointless. Derek had caused enormous harm, but that harm was now driving reforms that might prevent future cases. I never returned to the house I'd shared with Derek. It sold within 3 months, and I used my portion of the proceeds for a down payment on a small condo near Natalie. The new space felt clean and safe, untainted by memories of poisoning or lies. I decorated it carefully, choosing everything myself without compromise or input. Every piece of furniture, every paint color, every detail was mine alone. The autonomy felt revolutionary after years of being systematically controlled and harmed. Dr. Brennan continued monitoring my health, which improved steadily. 2 years after the poisoning stopped, my kidney and liver functions returned to normal ranges. My hair grew back thicker than before. My energy returned completely. I looked and felt healthy, no longer carrying the physical evidence of Derek's crimes. The recovery felt like reclaiming my body, taking back what he'd tried to destroy. Dr. Brennan said I'd been lucky, that longer exposure could have caused permanent damage or death. I'd survived by discovering the truth in time. I started dating again eventually, though trust came slowly. I met someone through the advocacy group, another survivor of partner abuse who understood trauma without needing explanations. We took everything at a glacial pace, building friendship before anything else. He respected my boundaries and my need for independence. 3 years after Derek's arrest, we moved in together, creating a home built on honesty and safety. It felt nothing like my marriage had. There were no secrets, no control, no fear, just partnership and respect. Derek's network was completely dismantled. All 23 members were convicted on various charges. Gregory Fan received 15 years. Others received sentences ranging from probation to a decade in prison depending on their involvement. The FBI estimated they'd prevented over $10 million in future fraud by shutting down the operation. Hundreds of potential victims were spared the exploitation I'd experienced. The case became a training example for healthcare fraud investigators, taught at the FBI Academy as a case study in complex medical schemes. I received a letter from Derek 5 years into his sentence. His attorney forwarded it, asking if I wanted to read it. I debated for a week before opening it. Inside, Derek had written 3 pages of apology, claiming he'd been addicted to money and power, that he'd lost himself in the scheme. He said he thought about what he'd done to me every day, that he understood if I never forgave him. He said he was in therapy in prison, trying to understand how he'd become capable of such harm. The letter felt manipulative even in its contrition, calculated to earn sympathy. I read it once and then burned it, watching the pages curl and blacken. I didn't need his apology. I'd already moved forward without it. The oncologist who'd started everything, Dr. Reyes, became a friend. We met for coffee occasionally, and she updated me on changes in medical fraud prevention at her hospital. They'd implemented new verification systems, cross-referencing prescriptions with diagnostic codes automatically. They'd trained staff to recognize inconsistencies between patient appearance and claim diagnoses. Dr. Reyes said my case had transformed their approach to fraud detection, making them vigilant in ways they hadn't been before. She thanked me for my courage in coming forward, saying I'd prevented other victims. I learned that Derek had targeted me specifically because of my job at the county clerk's office. He'd needed someone with access to legal documents and vital records for the fraud network. He'd courted me deliberately, researched my background, built a relationship designed to position me as an unknowing asset. When I couldn't provide the access he wanted, he'd switched strategies, deciding to use me as cover for his fake diagnosis instead. Our entire relationship had been transactional from his perspective, built on calculated manipulation. Understanding that helped me stop blaming myself for missing the signs. There'd been no signs to miss because everything had been carefully constructed deception. 8 years after the poisoning ended, I stood in my kitchen making coffee and realized I felt completely safe. The anxiety that had shadowed me for years had finally faded. I could prepare food without paranoia. I could accept drinks from my partner without fear. I could trust again, not blindly but thoughtfully. The healing had taken nearly a decade, but I'd reclaimed my life completely. Derek's crimes no longer defined my existence. They were something that had happened to me, not something I was still living through. I testified one final time when Derek came up for a sentence review hearing 8 years into his 22-year sentence. He was seeking early release for good behavior. I spoke for 10 minutes, describing the lasting impact of his crimes and the years I'd spent recovering. I explained that while I'd healed, the violation of trust and body autonomy had changed me permanently. I asked the judge to deny his request. She did, stating that Derek's crimes were too severe and his victim impact too significant to warrant early release. He'd serve his full sentence. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the final weight lift. He couldn't touch my life anymore, couldn't ask for clemency or reach me in any way. I was finally, completely free. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.